Plants use the sun's energy to make carbohydrate from carbon dioxide and water, which is called photosynthesis. Then humans and animals eat the plants and use the carbohydrate as fuel for their bodies. During digestion, the energy-yielding nutrients, your carbs, proteins, and fats, are broken down to monosaccharides, fatty acids, glycerol, and amino acids, which, as we've discussed in a prior chapter, that these are the end products of digestion. And these end products of digestion are absorbed, and once they get into the cells, they are metabolized. And during metabolism, they're broken down further into energy, which is ATP, water, and carbon dioxide. Metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions that go on in living cells, whereas energy metabolism is a little more specific and includes all the ways the body acquires and utilizes energy from food. Metabolic reactions take place inside of cells, especially liver cells. The liver is the most metabolically active organ within the body. Anabolism and catabolism are actually two different types of reactions. Anabolic reactions are building up large molecules from small molecules, and these types of reactions require energy. For example, glucose units being joined to form glycogen, individual amino acids being linked to form a protein, joining 3 fatty acids and glycerol to make a triglyceride. Those are all anabolic reactions. And these are the reverse of catabolic reactions or catabolism, which are breaking down large molecules into smaller molecules and thereby releasing energy or releasing ATP. This slide is an illustration of anabolic and catabolic reactions. Energy used or released in the body is in the form of ATP. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the major energy carrier in most cells. You can see the structure as adenosine and then 3 phosphate groups. Adenosine is adenine and ribose, which is a sugar. And in the bottom illustration, it shows how energy produced during the hydrolysis or the splitting of ATP is used to do the body's work. So ATP is split to be ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, plus a phosphate molecule. And then energy from the breakdown of carbohydrate, protein, and fat can be used to create ATP. So ADP is joined again with a phosphate molecule to make ATP. The first of the 3 energy nutrients we're going to look at for breaking down to produce ATP for the body is glucose. The first step in the breakdown of glucose is called glycolysis, or glucose splitting. Glycolysis is defined as the metabolic breakdown of glucose to pyruvate. And note that glucose, as you remember, is a 6-carbon compound, and it breaks down to pyruvate. It actually breaks down to 2 pyruvates, and they're each 3-carbon compounds. Then pyruvate has the option, if oxygen is not available, so that would be anaerobic reaction, to form lactate. And that occurs in exercises such as a short, fast sprint, for example. Not much oxygen is available to the muscles, and it will fuel very quick, short bursts of activity. If oxygen is available, that is an aerobic reaction, and pyruvate then, instead of forming lactic acid or lactate, would form acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is a 2-carbon compound, and it has it will then enter the tricarboxylic acid cycle and will have a much greater total energy or ATP yield. And an aerobic reaction would take place in activities such as hiking for an hour, running, other endurance type activities. So activities where they're not so intense that you can get oxygen to the working muscles. This is a diagram of glycolysis. So at the top you see glucose, which is a 6-carbon compound, and at the bottom you see 2 pyruvates, and they're each 3-carbon compounds. And there are many steps along the pathway, and you're not responsible for knowing all those steps. You just need to know that 1 glucose makes 2 pyruvates, and glucose is a 6-carbon compound, and it makes 2 3-carbon compounds of pyruvate. What else is important to know is that it uses some ATP along the pathway near the top, but it also produces ATP. There's a net gain of 2 ATPs. It takes in 2 ATPs, but it releases 4 ATPs. So there's again a net gain of 2 ATPs. This is a diagram of the Cori cycle. And you see glucose, a 6-carbon compound at the top, and glucose forms pyruvate, which are 2 3-carbon compounds, and that yields a net of 2 ATPs. And when oxygen is not available or there's insufficient mitochondria, then pyruvate accepts hydrogen ions from the glucose breakdown and will become lactate. And I'm sure all of you have felt kind of that when you're running really fast and a short sprint where your legs kind of tie up and you can't go any further. That's when that lactate kind of builds up in your legs, and it causes some muscle fatigue. And so then you have to slow down, and what happens is the lactate will travel to the liver and then be converted back to glucose. And then the glucose can return to the muscles and provide energy for you to continue. It's important to note here that the step of glucose to pyruvate or glycolysis is a reversible step. You have a 6-carbon compound to 2 3-carbon compounds, so glucose can form pyruvate, and then the 2 3-carbon compounds can go back to form glucose. And then, as we mentioned, when oxygen wasn't available, that pyruvate formed lactate, which again can go back to form glucose. So glucose to pyruvate is a reversible reaction, whereas the next step in the metabolic breakdown of glucose is from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. And this is when oxygen is present. So this is an aerobic step. And pyruvate to acetyl-CoA is irreversible because you have pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon compound, to acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon compound, because one of the carbons is lost as CO2. So cells cannot retrieve that carbon back from carbon dioxide to remake pyruvate and then back up to glucose. And we'll look at this again in a larger diagram. There's much more ATP that is produced as acetyl-CoA goes through the aerobic breakdown. Remember, glycolysis only produced 2 ATP. Acetyl-CoA's option are either to synthesize fats when the body has enough energy, or generate ATP when the cell or body is low in energy. This diagram shows the 2 pyruvates, 2 3-carbon compounds, being converted to 2 acetyl-CoAs with 2 molecules of carbon dioxide lost. And then the acetyl-CoA goes on to the TCA cycle. And this is an aerobic step. It's not reversible. And as you can see, the hydrogens or the electrons will be transported to the electron transport chain. This is a simplified diagram not showing all the carbons. And you see glucose to pyruvate, which is glycolysis. It's a reversible step. You can see the arrows going up and one going down. And it does not require, so it's an anaerobic step and produces a small amount of ATP. And then pyruvate, when oxygen is present, goes to acetyl-CoA. That is not a reversible step, and it does require oxygen, so it's an aerobic step. And then acetyl-CoA would go into the tricarboxylic acid cycle. When pyruvate is formed and there's not oxygen available, you can see that it goes to lactic acid. And that is a reversible step that can go where the lactic acid goes back into the liver, then it is converted to pyruvate and back up to glucose. And that was the Cori cycle. And in the next slides, we're going to see how glycerol and fatty acids enter the metabolic pathways, where glycerol can be converted to glucose, and glucose can be converted to glycerol, and fatty acids can be converted to acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA can be converted to fatty acids. So those are reversible steps. And some amino acids can be converted to pyruvate, and some amino acids are converted to acetyl-CoA when they're metabolized. The amino acids that are converted to pyruvate are called glucogenic amino acids because those are the ones that can ultimately make glucose. Amino acids that are ketogenic cannot make glucose, but they can make either ketones or fatty acids. This is just another diagram of the complete pathway of glucose. Glucose to pyruvate, and then pyruvate to acetyl-CoA at the bottom, and then acetyl-CoA onto the TCA cycle. And again, for that whole process to take place, oxygen would have to be available. Next is the metabolism of fat. And remember, the major type of fat in your diet is triglycerides. And triglycerides are made up of glycerol and fatty acids. Glycerol being a 3-carbon compound, and fatty acids can be all different chain lengths. Remember, all different chain lengths of carbon molecules. So the conversion of glycerol to pyruvate is easy because they're both 3-carbon compounds. Glycerol is just a small amount of that triglyceride, though. Remember, it's just 3 carbons of many in that triglyceride because the majority of the carbons are in the fatty acids. So glycerol can yield glucose. It's the only part of the triglyceride that can yield glucose, but only a very small amount. So only about 5% of the triglyceride can be converted to glucose. So often we say that you can't make glucose from fat because as a general rule, the majority of fat or fatty acids cannot be converted to triglyceride. Only the glycerol portion can. Fatty acids are converted to acetyl-CoA instead of back up to glucose. And this conversion is called beta oxidation, when fatty acids are broken down into 2-carbon fragments to make acetyl-CoA. Fatty acids cannot be used to synthesize glucose, as I mentioned, and glucose must be available, remember, to provide fuel to the red blood cells, brain, and nervous system. So if fatty acids, which you have plenty of in your body, even if you're very lean, cannot be synthesized to make glucose, then what can be used to make glucose if you're not eating glucose or eating carbohydrate? The answer is protein. We saw in the prior slide the different amino acids, the glucogenic amino acids can be used to make glucose. This slide illustrates beta oxidation, where you have a fatty acid, which is a long chain of carbons. And remember, there are mostly always an even number of carbons. And this process uses ATP. And what happens is the carbons are broken off 2 at a time. If you look over to the right-hand side of the slide, and you'll see 2 carbon fragments being broken down. So one's acetyl-CoA, and then another 2-carbon compound breaks off the chain to make a second acetyl-CoA, and so on down the line until you have multiple acetyl-CoAs formed. This diagram shows at the top, you see a 3-carbon compound which is glycerol, and it has 3 fatty acids attached, the long chains of carbon. And the triglyceride is broken into glycerol and fatty acids. The glycerol enters the pathway, the energy pathway, and can be converted to pyruvate, which is then can form glucose. The other option is glycerol enters the pathway, forms pyruvate, and if the body needs energy, then pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA, and then acetyl-CoA goes on to the TCA cycle. The fatty acids, on the other hand, undergo beta oxidation, so they're broken down into 2 carbon compounds, and they're attached to CoA, the compound CoA, and then they form acetyl-CoA, and those can enter the TCA cycle. So this is a good illustration of how much energy you can get from fats. Look at all the acetyl-CoAs from the fatty acids that enter the TCA cycle versus the 2 acetyl-CoAs that enter the TCA cycle from glucose. Even when you have enough fat and carbohydrate in the diet, protein will still be used in part for fuel. So amino acids can be metabolized to form ATP or energy for the body. Metabolism of amino acids occurs after they're deaminated, or deamination is the removal of the nitrogen-containing amino group. Some amino acids can enter the TCA cycle directly, whereas others are glucogenic and they enter at the point of pyruvate. Glucogenic amino acids can therefore make glucose and are a fairly good source of glucose when carbohydrate is not available. However, they're not a desirable form. It's not desirable to have amino acids form glucose because amino acids are needed for so many other things. They're needed to make enzymes, they're needed to make hormones, to make antibodies so that you can have a strong immune system. They're needed to build muscle tissue. So you don't want to be using a lot of amino acids for energy, and particularly to make glucose. So you have these amino acids that can enter at pyruvate, and then you also have amino acids that can be converted to acetyl-CoA. Those are called ketogenic, and those can be used to provide ATP or to make body fat should your overall diet be so plentiful in calories that you don't need to be building any muscle tissue at the time. You've got plenty of enzymes, hormones, your antibodies, all your amino acids, and are just, instead of being stored, there's not really a storage place for amino acids, so then they would be converted to body fat. This diagram shows the glucogenic amino acids entering at pyruvate, which is a reversible reaction, the ketogenic entering at acetyl-CoA, which is not reversible, and then some amino acids entering at the TCA cycle. When amino acids are metabolized, they can be either deaminated, which the amino group is removed, and 2 products are formed, a keto acid as well as ammonia. The other reaction that can take place in the metabolism of amino acids is transamination, and that is transferring the amino group from one amino acid to a keto acid to make a different amino acid. So you're transaminating one amino acid into a different one. When you have an excess of protein or amino acids in the diet, or if your diet lacks carbohydrate or glucose, you'll often break down the amino acids for energy. And when this happens, they're deaminated, or the nitrogen-containing group, the amino group, is removed, and that forms ammonia in the liver. And ammonia is toxic to the liver, so the liver wants to try to get rid of it. So in order to get rid of it, the ammonia combines with carbon dioxide to form urea. And then urea is a waste product that's then excreted through the kidneys to get rid of that excess nitrogen. Here's another simplified overview of the energy yielding pathways. Let's say you eat a hamburger, which has protein, carbohydrate, and fat in it. If you look at the carbohydrate in the middle of the slide, your carbohydrate, remember, is all eventually converted to glucose. And then that glucose within the mitochondria of the cell will be converted to pyruvate. and then pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, which then enters the TCA cycle and then onto the electron transport chain to produce a lot of ATP. The protein will be broken down to amino acids, remember, upon the digestive process, and those amino acids are absorbed. And if utilized for energy and not utilized to make enzymes or hormones or antibodies or building tissue, but let's say, again, you have a lower calorie intake or a lower carb intake, then those amino acids are going to be deaminated and they will enter the pathway either at pyruvate, if it's a glucogenic amino acid, or acetyl-CoA, if it's a ketogenic amino acid, or directly into the TCA cycle to produce ATP. Fat, or triglyceride, is broken down to glycerol and fatty acids as part of the digestive process. And remember, glycerol can enter, it's a 3-carbon compound, can be converted to pyruvate, and pyruvate can either be converted back up to glucose if your body needs glucose, or it will go on to acetyl-CoA, TCA cycle, and electron transport chain to produce a lot of ATP. Fatty acids enter the pathway at acetyl-CoA, and remember that happens with the process occurring of beta oxidation, where 2 carbon fragments are removed at a time, forming acetyl-CoA. And then that acetyl-CoA cannot make glucose, but it can enter the TCA cycle and then electron transport chain and produce a lot of ATP. This is a summary chart. And if you look to the left, you see the nutrients. Remember, the end products of digestion are glucose, fatty acids, glycerol, and amino acids. And those are the ones that are absorbed. So those are the 4 compounds that enter the energy pathways. They all yield energy or calories. In terms of whether or not they can yield glucose, remember, glucose obviously can yield glucose. Fatty acids cannot be converted to glucose. Glycerol can be converted to glucose when carbohydrate is unavailable. And remember, amino acids can also be converted to glucose when carbohydrate is unavailable. It's not the desirable thing for amino acid to be converted to glucose, but it can occur. In terms of producing or yielding amino acids, glucose, if nitrogen is available, can yield non-essential amino acids. Remember, those are the ones that the body can make. You don't have to get them from the diet because your body can make them. But there has to be enough protein in the diet overall because there has to be enough nitrogen available. Fatty acids cannot yield amino acids. Glycerol can, again, when nitrogen is available. And amino acids can also yield amino acids. In terms of producing body fat, if you overconsume any of these and your calories are sufficient, they can be converted to body fat. So glucose, fatty acids, glycerol, and amino acids, when calories are overconsumed and all these energy nutrients are overconsumed, they can yield fat. In summary, glucose and fatty acids are primarily used for energy, and amino acids are to a lesser extent, but remember, we want to keep those from being utilized for energy as much as possible so they can be used for other important functions in the body. Glucose is made from all carbohydrates and most amino acids and the glycerol portion of fat. So all of those can make glucose. Protein is only made from amino acids. Glucose can be made into non-essential amino acids if nitrogen is present, and so can glycerol. And then all energy-yielding nutrients consumed in excess can be converted to body fat and contribute to our storage of fat in the body. This diagram shows where the metabolic reactions take place within the cell. And in the cytoplasm, or the cytosol, is where glycolysis occurs. And then the other energy reactions, or the metabolic reactions, take place within the mitochondria. Some take place in the inner membrane, and some in the inner compartment of the mitochondria. In the inner membrane is the site of the electron transport chain, and in the inner compartment of the mitochondria is where the pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, fatty acid oxidation, and the TCA cycle take place. But the main point in this cell is that the majority of the metabolic reactions producing ATP take place within the mitochondria, which is why that's called the powerhouse of the cell. It's only glycolysis that takes place in the cytosol. As mentioned, the TCA cycle takes place in the inner part of the mitochondria. And when cells need energy, acetyl-CoA, remember acetyl-CoA was that merge point of all the energy nutrients. And that acetyl-CoA enters the TCA cycle where the majority of ATP is produced along with the electron transport chain. Oxaloacetate is a substance that is important to keep that TCA cycle going. And as we're going to see in the next diagram, we're going to see how important it is to have carbohydrate in the diet to keep that TCA cycle going. So its role is critical, and if it's not sufficient, the TCA cycle will slow down. In this class, it's not mandatory to memorize all the details of the TCA cycle, but it's important to take a look at oxaloacetate. It's up near the left-hand corner, the upper left-hand corner. And oxaloacetate is generated from pyruvate. And remember, pyruvate comes from glucose. It can come from a little bit of the glycerol, coming from the triglyceride, or from amino acids. But again, that's not what we really want to be using our amino acids for energy. So the majority of your pyruvate comes from having plenty of carbohydrate in the diet. So that is what generates the oxaloacetate to then allow the acetyl-CoA to enter the TCA cycle. And that's where you're getting, again, a lot of the ATP production along with the electron transport chain. So very important to have enough carbohydrate in the diet to produce ATP. The electron transport chain is the last stage in the metabolism of your energy nutrients, and it takes place in the mitochondria of the cell. You're not responsible for knowing all the detail, but just to run through it real quickly, if you look in the lower left-hand corner of the slide, coenzymes are delivering hydrogens and high-energy electrons to the electron transport chain, and that they come from the TCA cycle. And then up above, where it states electron transport chain, passing electrons from carrier to carrier along the chain releases enough energy to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. Then oxygen accepts those electrons and combines with hydrogens to form water. And then ATP is synthesized when hydrogen ions are flowing downhill from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration through a special protein complex that therefore powers that synthesis of ATP. And you can look below how ADP combined with a phosphate group forms ATP. This slide is another summary of the electron transport chain. And I think it's important to remember at this point that each ATP produced holds energy, and that kilocalories measure energy. Thus, the more ATP, the more kilocalories an energy nutrient would provide. So for example, when a glucose molecule is completely oxidized, it'll yield about 30 to 32 ATPs. But when a fatty acid is completely oxidized, and let's say it's a 16 carbon fatty acid, it yields approximately 129 ATP. So it will yield a much higher amount of ATP, and therefore it has more kilocalories in it upon oxidation. So more kilocalories per gram. It's more energy dense than a glucose molecule. This is an excellent relationships between the metabolism of all three energy nutrients. So you can see the glucose pathway, then how the amino acids come into the pathway to produce ATP, and then triglycerides or fatty acids and glycerol. And I want to show you why it's so important to learn all of these pathways, just to be able to understand some of the things that you might read in an everyday magazine. For example, you might read that it's much easier to convert dietary fat into body fat than it is to convert dietary carbohydrate or protein into body fat. It's a much easier, it doesn't take much energy. And if you had 100, let's say you ate 100 extra calories of carbohydrates, or you ate 100 extra calories of your protein or amino acids, your body would only convert about 75. It's about 75% efficient in converting those calories into body fat. So you might only get 75 calories of body fat out of the 100 calories of excess carbohydrate or protein. Whereas fat, if you overconsume dietary fat, it's about 100% efficient. If you consume over 100 extra calories of excess dietary fat, you're going to get about extra 100 calories of body fat. And so if you look at these pathways, look at all the steps it takes to convert carbohydrates into body fat. Glucose has to be converted to pyruvate. Pyruvate has to go to glycerol. Some pyruvate would have to go to acetyl-CoA and form fatty acid fragments that are rejoined to form fatty acids. And then the glycerol and fatty acids would have to rejoin to form triglycerides or body fat. A lot of steps in that process that use up energy to form body fat. The same thing goes for amino acids. They have to go through a lot of steps, metabolic steps, to form glycerol, and then the ketogenic amino acids have to form acetyl-CoA, then the fatty acid fragments that are rejoined to make fatty acids, and that has to be put back together to make body fat. A lot of steps, it uses up a lot of energy to make body fat. So when you read that fat is more efficiently turned into body fat than dietary carbohydrate or protein, this diagram helps to explain why. The other thing that you read often is that when you don't eat enough carbohydrates, that you might lose some lean body mass. Because what happens if you don't have glucose available for the brain and nervous system, your body's going to make it from protein. The amino acids that are glucogenic will make pyruvate, and then pyruvate will make the glucose that you need. For the most part, you cannot make much glucose from triglycerides. If you look over here at the glycerol, it's only a small part of the triglyceride that can be made into pyruvate and then up to glucose. So generally speaking, we say that you cannot make glucose from fat, from dietary fat or body fat. You would only make glucose from protein. So again, this type of diagram can explain a lot of those processes. It will illustrate it, some of the everyday things that you might read and hear. This slide repeats what I mentioned earlier, is that fat provides the most energy or ATP per gram. Nearly all the bonds in a fatty acid are between carbon and hydrogen, so oxygen can be added to all of them. And lots of hydrogen atoms or electrons are then released to the electron transport chain, yielding a lot of ATP. So 129 ATP can be formed from a 16-carbon fatty acid. Glucose is less calories per gram because oxygen is already bonded to carbon and fewer hydrogens are therefore released to the electron transport chain. So a molecule of glucose will only yield about 30 to 32 ATPs. You don't have to memorize the process of this occurring, but you should remember that fat provides more energy or calories per gram, 9 calories per gram. It produces a lot more ATP than glucose, which only provides 4 calories per gram. The next few slides discuss energy balance. And when we have excess energy or excess calories, we're considered in a feasting state. Excess protein can be converted to fat, but its priority, as mentioned, are other roles such as your enzymes, hormones, antibodies, building muscle tissue. And therefore it can be converted to fat, but this is an inefficient and indirect process, as we mentioned. But it can happen if there's excess protein as well as excess calories. Excess carbohydrate can also be converted to fat, but its first priority is to fill up its glycogen stores, fill up the body's glycogen stores. Once the stores are full, then the excess will be converted to body fat. And as we mentioned and as we saw in the diagram of all the metabolic processes of your energy nutrients, excess fat is very efficiently converted to body fat. And when you transition then from feasting or over-consuming calories to fasting, you'll start to draw on your reserves. So in fasting, you have inadequate energy or inadequate calories. And as mentioned, glucose is needed for the brain and the nervous system. So the first priority of the body is to provide that glucose. And if it's not available from the diet, if there's not enough carbohydrate or enough calories, protein is going to be converted to glucose to help meet those needs. It happens at a very rapid rate. And in order for the body to slow the degradation of protein, because whenever it's in a starved state, initially protein will be utilized very quickly, and then your body has self-preservation mechanisms to slow that degradation of protein. And the self-preservation mechanism is that shift to what we call ketosis. And ketones are produced from those fatty acid fragments when glucose is not available. And ketosis also suppresses the appetite, and it slows down metabolism. Again, these are all self-preservation mechanisms to help to preserve the body's protein and help the body live for a long time when there's inadequate calories or energy. Symptoms of starvation include muscle wasting, decreased heart rate, respiratory rate, metabolic rate, and body temperature. So think about it. Going on a really low-calorie diet or fasting kind of defeats the purpose because it's going to lower your metabolic rate and help you. You're in a starved state. You kind of hang on to the body fat, but yet you might have muscle or lean body mass wasting. Impaired vision can occur, as well as problems with your organs, because organs are made up of tissue that is made up of proteins, and your immune system might be compromised. Remember that proteins make your antibodies, and depression and anxiety can also set in. This diagram, feasting and fasting. So letter A at the top describes feasting. And if you look at carbohydrates, which are broken down to glucose in the body, and then they'll be absorbed. And when you're feasting, the first thing that's going to happen is your liver and muscle glycogen stores are going to become full. That's your body's preference. And then excess glucose beyond that will be converted to body fat. In terms of feasting and excess dietary fat, they'll be broken down in the body to one of the glycerol and fatty acids, and the fatty acids are converted into body fat. Very efficient process. Protein is broken down upon the digestive system, amino acids, which are absorbed, and amino acids go to build different body proteins, your enzymes, hormones, antibodies, tissues, and then if if you feasted over and above your calories and protein requirements, then the excess amino acids will be deaminated, and you're going to lose the nitrogen, which will be excreted as urea. And then the carbon skeleton that's left over will be converted to body fat. So all three energy nutrients can be converted to body fat when you overconsume calories, greater than your needs, greater than you're expending. Under letter B, you can see the first stages of fasting. First thing that's going to happen is the body's going to use up the liver and the muscle glycogen stores. So the glucose will then be used to fuel the brain and the nervous system and also the red blood cells. And then it will also fuel other cells. Body fat stores will be broken down. Remember, a little bit of glycerol, but primarily they're fatty acids. And the fatty acids can provide energy for cells as well. Once the fast continues beyond glycogen depletion, in letter C, what happens is the body protein that has been broken down to amino acids will start to be used to make glucose, because remember, glucose is needed for the brain and the nervous system and also red blood cells. And so that starts to happen at a very rapid rate. And there's a loss of that nitrogen from the deamination of the amino acids, and that's lost through the kidneys as urea. So to slow the degradation of the body protein down after glycogen depletion, your body kicks into ketosis. So the fatty acid fragments, the 2 carbon fragments, are broken down or are converted to ketone bodies. And ketone bodies are small carbon compounds that can then be used to also fuel the brain and the nervous system. It slows down, it can be used for energy for other cells too. So that's how people can have some energy when they're fasting. They get it from the ketone bodies. It's not a very efficient source of energy, but it is a source of energy. Your body will still continue to break down a little body protein because your brain and nervous system still need a little bit of glucose. So it doesn't completely stop the wasting away of your lean tissue, but it will greatly slow down all your metabolism and slow down the degradation of that body protein. So I usually don't recommend fasting because it's not really a very healthy process. And I tend also not to recommend the really low carbohydrate diets. We talked about trying to keep a minimum of at least 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrate in your diet a day. And that is, again, to stay out of the slowed metabolism, going into ketosis, losing lean body tissue. A ketogenic diet, however, is being promoted by many experts in the field as helping to control blood sugar levels and for weight loss. And a ketogenic diet is one that's very high in fat, moderate in protein, but extremely low in carbs. Metabolism is going to be similar to fasting. And so you're going to use your glycogen stores first, and then you're going to start to make glucose from protein, which is gluconeogenesis. And body tissues are going to be used somewhat even when protein is provided in the diet. So ketosis is going to be induced by following this really low carbohydrate diet. And ketones can be detected in the urine. So that's one way for an individual to know whether or not they're in ketosis. They can get strips that would test their urine for ketones. In terms of ketosis and weight loss, much of the weight loss, once you go on a really low carbohydrate diet, is due to the loss of glycogen and water. When you lose glycogen, or when you store glycogen, you also store water. So when you lose it, you also lose body water. So The weight loss diets that are low carbohydrate diets, where you lose like 10 pounds the first week, that's due to primarily a loss of glycogen and water. And you'll also lose just a little bit of body protein, as well as some minerals, because a lot of your electrolytes are lost when your body's trying to get rid of the ketones. Some of the beneficial metabolic changes that can occur short term along with weight loss are helping to improve insulin usage. So someone might become less insulin resistant. Sometimes blood pressure comes down, and sometimes they've even noticed a decrease in cholesterol and triglycerides. So lowered blood sugar, lowered blood pressure, lowered cholesterol and triglycerides. So, can all be benefits of going on a ketogenic type diet. But some of the drawbacks are a following a really high fat diet is it's hard to maintain, and you often don't feel as good when you're really restricting carbohydrates. You might have hunger, fatigue, you might be moody, irritable. It can cause constipation because without a lot of carbohydrates, you're not getting the fiber. Often individuals get headache or brain fog. And there's, negative side effects of ketogenic diets can also be an increased risk of kidney stones and osteoporosis, because often you're losing calcium. And it can also trigger gout or an increased level of uric acid in susceptible people, because your blood's, your system's a little more acidic. And again, possible nutrient deficiencies can arise because of the lack of carbohydrate and the carbohydrate foods that can be very nutritious, and definitely a lack of the fiber as mentioned, and a lack of phytochemicals that are, really important for your health in terms of having antioxidant function and other functions that can help prevent cancer and heart disease. And this is an excellent video study tool from Khan Academy that you can view. The highlight at the end of the chapter is on alcohol and nutrition. Alcohol as a beverage is ethyl alcohol or ethanol, and the metabolism of alcohol is handled differently in the body. It interferes with metabolism and impairs health and nutrition. However, there are potential health benefits to consuming moderate amounts of alcohol. Alcohol is in beverages such as beer, wine, and distilled liquor or hard liquor. It behaves like a drug, therefore altering body functions. Moderate amounts of alcohol is acceptable and may have some potential health benefits. An accepted definition of moderation is up to 2 drinks per day for men and up to 1 drink per day for women. And what equals a drink is either 5 ounces of wine, 10 ounces of wine cooler, 12 ounces of beer, or 1.5 ounces of distilled or hard liquor. So each of those is considered equal to 1 drink. And this is a visual of what is considered a drink. You see the 5 ounces of wine, 12 ounces of beer, 10 ounces of wine cooler, or 1.5 ounces of hard liquor. Alcohol can be very quickly absorbed in the body. It can be absorbed right through the stomach. So if you've eaten carbohydrates and have carbohydrates in your stomach, that can help decrease the absorption of alcohol. The enzyme that breaks down alcohol in the stomach is called alcohol dehydrogenase. And women have less of this enzyme and therefore can absorb more alcohol than men. And that's one reason why the recommendation for moderation is only 1 drink for women, but it is up to 2 drinks for men. It's not only that men are larger, but it's also that men will absorb less because they have more of the alcohol dehydrogenase. Alcohol goes to the liver after it's been absorbed. It's a toxin, so the liver is going to try to get rid of it, and it can get rid of some of it. However, it does promote the accumulation of fatty acids, which eventually can lead to a fatty liver. And the diagram at the bottom of the slide shows the metabolism of alcohol and why this occurs. Alcohol is broken down in the liver to acetaldehyde by alcohol dehydrogenase. That's the same enzyme that's also in the stomach. And then acetaldehyde can be broken down further to acetate and then further to acetyl-CoA. And as you remember, acetyl-CoA can enter the tricarboxylic acid cycle or TCA cycle and produce ATP and energy. But what occurs is NAD, which is a coenzyme, it picks up electrons and carries them off to the electron transport chain. And in doing so, this process uses up NAD, which is needed for other parts of the metabolic process. So it uses up NAD and it produces a lot of NADH. And what happens then is you can see where the accumulation of NADH, the excess of it, tends to block the acetyl-CoA from entering the TCA cycle. And so when the acetyl-CoA cannot continue on to the TCA cycle and produce ATP, it accumulates and it actually will go a different pathway to form fatty acid fragments and promote the accumulation of body fat, which then accumulates around the liver. Fatty liver is therefore the first stage of liver deterioration or liver disease. The second stage is called fibrosis, and that's a scarring of the liver. And both of these stages are considered reversible should the person stop drinking or greatly minimize their alcoholic consumption. Cirrhosis is the third stage and is the most advanced stage of liver disease and is considered irreversible, once it happens, once it occurs, and it can lead to further complications such as liver cancer. The microsomal ethanol oxidizing system, or MEOS, is an enzyme system in the liver that metabolizes alcohol and drugs. It can handle up to about a fifth of the total alcohol that a person, consumes. And if a person keeps consuming a lot of alcohol over time, the individual will develop a stronger MEOS system and they'll become more tolerant of large amounts of alcohol. And that's not necessarily a good thing. It's just something that occurs over time with an excess amount of alcohol consumption. One thing to note about this system is and it's a reason not to take medication if you're also going to be drinking, because the body will preferentially metabolize the alcohol, or the system will preferentially metabolize and get rid of the alcohol, and therefore the drugs consumed, especially prescription drugs, could build up to dangerously high levels. And that's why often you'll see, if you're taking a prescription drug, is never to drink alcohol when you take that medication. Other side effects of alcohol as it arrives in the brain is it acts as a narcotic and it can help alleviate pain. It also suppresses the antidiuretic hormone, and that would result as a loss of body water. So we consider alcohol as being a diuretic, and it can lead to dehydration. As alcohol arrives in the brain, the first part of the brain that will be affected is the frontal lobe, and that's where judgment and reasoning takes place. The second is the midbrain, where speech and vision would be impaired. Third would be the cerebellum, and that's where there's voluntary muscular control, so coordination would be affected. And fourth is where respiration and heart action are controlled. And so, for example, if someone was at a party and they were binge drinking and they drank so much that your body's your stomach's not able to break it down. It goes through the liver, and the liver's not able to, it only breaks down like a fifth of it, and then it circulates through a little bit through the brain and back through the liver. It breaks down a little bit more, keeps accumulating more and more in the brain. It can eventually affect that very inner portion, the medulla, and what can happen is it can stop respiration and stop the heart from pumping and eventually lead to death. And so that's where binge drinking can be so dangerous, it can reach those inner parts of the brain. This table shows alcohol doses and approximate blood level percentages for men and women. So you can look at the chart for a male or female and look at the body weight and then the number of drinks per hour someone would take in and determine the approximate alcohol blood level that person might be at. And again, this is theoretical, so it might not always be exact as what the chart would show. This chart shows the blood alcohol concentration and then typical effects. So at 0.02, loss of judgment, that would be when the alcohol is reaching the frontal lobe of the brain. 0.05, exaggerated behavior, some loss of muscle control, along with impaired judgment and lowered alertness. 0.08, where poor muscle coordination would take place, as well as a lack of reasoning, memory, impaired self-control. 0.10 is deterioration in reaction time and control, slurred speech, poor coordination, slowed thinking, and it just continues on until, if you look at the very bottom at 0.40, a lethal dose where the heartbeat and respiration would slow down dramatically and may even stop. Remember that alcohol contains 7 calories per gram, and it also promotes the accumulation of body fat because of the way it's metabolized. So drinking a lot of alcohol will promote central obesity, or the gaining weight around the middle section. It also can displace food. Often, a lot of people might, if they drink a lot, they're not going to be eating as well. And it can not only, it only provides empty calories, it also can make someone lose more B vitamins. And that can be because some of the B vitamins the absorption is blocked. It also causes mineral losses. Minerals are lost through excretion. Alcohol causes excretion of calcium, magnesium, many of your important electrolytes, because it's a diuretic. And one condition that can occur from drinking a lot is the Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, and that's caused by a deficiency of thiamine. And symptoms of that disease are where a lot of weakness, confusion, lack of muscle coordination. So if an alcoholic enters a hospital, they might not be drinking at the time, but they might appear drunk because they are confused, they do have a lack of coordination, and it can be due to a B vitamin deficiency such as thiamine. And when alcoholics enter rehab, one of the first things that happens is they're put on a really high dose of B vitamins. They're often given like a B vitamin shot to help start to replenish some of the lost nutrients. As mentioned, heavy drinkers often have an inadequate food intake and the impaired nutrient metabolism that we mentioned, the thiamine deficiency, as well as other B vitamins such as B6 and folate. And this, again, slide just shows some of the symptoms I mentioned for Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. And some of the symptoms are very similar to when an alcoholic is actually drinking. Short-term effects of alcohol abuse include a higher rate of accidents and binge drinking, which, as we mentioned, can result in death. Longer-term effects of too much alcohol during pregnancy, it can lead to something called fetal alcohol effect or fetal alcohol syndrome in the child, which is not curable, and it leads to mental retardation as well as slowed growth and other physical problems. So a woman should never drink when she's pregnant. Alcohol abuse is the third leading cause of preventable death. There's a whole list of other long-term effects of heavy alcohol consumption: arthritis, cancer, fetal alcohol syndrome, as we mentioned, heart disease, high blood sugar or low blood sugar swings after consuming alcohol, infertility, kidney disease, liver disease, malnutrition, nervous disorders, obesity, and psychological disturbances. So many long-term potential effects with too much alcohol. There are also a couple health benefits with consuming alcohol, and one is that alcohol, and particularly red wine, can raise your HDL or your good type of cholesterol. And another is it can help to lessen some stress. So some personal strategies in consuming alcohol are to serve and consume non-alcoholic beverages, or to drink slowly, have food in your stomach and while you're drinking, and consume alcohol moderately. Moderate, remember, for women is 1 drink per day, and for men it's up to 2 drinks per day. And never drive after you've been drinking. The Highlight 7 on alcohol is excellent, and I strongly encourage you to read it. It goes over even more detail than I went over on the past slides. And that's the end of chapter 7.